Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing dismantling structural racism with distinguished professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, Dr. Glaude Jr. Learn about the history of racism in America and how the effects of segregation are still felt in today's society. Although we have made great progress as a nation, much work needs to be done to remove barriers towards upward mobility for minorities. Most importantly, what can each of us do to help the cause? Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Professor Glaude Jr. He is one of the nation's most preeminent scholars pertaining to African American history, as his background and education make him a renowned expert on the topic. Structural racism is a complicated entity, with many of its elements not overtly obvious in everyday life, but upon closer inspection, there are clear barriers that minorities experience in their path to success. This was an eye-opening interview for me. As a relatively privileged individual, I was educated by Professor Glaude Jr. on what the major elements of structural racism are, how they developed, and their impact on the lives of African Americans on a daily basis. No one can doubt that we have made tremendous progress as a country fighting racism and leveling the playing field for all minorities. But at the same time, we have much work to do. Overcoming structural racism will take a grassroots effort, with all of us doing our part. Listen up as we discuss dismantling structural racism. Check it out. Hey, Eddie, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Doc, trying to hold on.
Absolutely. Listen, thanks for joining us. Very excited to have you on the podcast to talk about an absolutely critical issue for our country, and that's structural racism, what it is, where it started, where it's going, and how do we dismantle it. So look forward to all your insights.
Sure. I'm honored and to have an opportunity to have this conversation, especially under these conditions.
Let's start with giving our listeners some background. What is the definition of structural racism? People may have heard the term, but they don't exactly know what it is.
It varies. I mean, there's this idea. One way you can think about it as accumulated advantage, right? Advantage that is accorded to particular groups over time, that is evidenced in the very ways in which institutions function. So what does it mean to say, for example, let's just use a historical example of the New Deal, that you had policies implemented that allowed for some people to gain access to FHA loans and other people who couldn't, and how the ability to buy homes at that time allowed for the expansion or the growth of the vaunted American middle class, but those who were excluded didn't have access to that capital. And so then that would have what? Accumulated advantage. Those families would be able to accumulate wealth and pass that wealth on to their children. Or think about redlining as another example. Banks that refuse to give loans to particular folk in specific neighborhoods, and how that would then impact the wealth gap. Or think about schools and segregation and the way schools were funded differentially based upon race, and how that differential funding impacted the quality of education in those spaces, and the way that would then accumulate over time. So part of what we're talking about when we're talking about structural racism is not an act of intention, that you are engaged in the act of discrimination because you hold certain views about Black people or about women or the like, but rather the way in which institutions reproduce disadvantage because of prior practices, historical practices that benefited certain groups and disadvantaged others.
Yeah, correct. I think you said it best. It's not always overt. It's not always obvious. It's in our system, and people think that that's just the way it's supposed to be, so they take it for granted. Does structural racism permeate all sectors and geographical areas equally?
I wouldn't say equally, but it does permeate all sectors. I mean, uh, one way to think about it is just think about spatially, how cities are organized, and the way in which certain communities are zoned in particular sorts of ways, how resources flow differently to those communities. And so you kind of learn race, for example, just simply by driving around, say, Princeton. Once I cross over a certain street, I'm in a community where there's predominantly Latino or predominantly Black, and you can immediately see the differences. Where I grew up in a small town of Moss Point, once you cross the railroad tracks, as it were, you saw communities that didn't have paved sidewalks. You had baseball diamonds that weren't cut. You moved over to another side and you saw something very, very different. And you're learning race not by way of intention in that moment, right? But you're learning it by way of navigating space. So think about healthcare and differential healthcare delivery and the way in which some communities have access, right, to healthcare. Some people have access to pain medicine. Some people have access to doctors. Some people have access, and some people don't. And we can tell a story about that in a really detailed way. So I think it exists across all sectors, at least major sectors, right? Education, healthcare, criminal justice. Or the criminal system. We can describe elements of structural racism in all of those spaces.
And we're going to get into a bunch of the topics you just mentioned, mainly healthcare and the criminal justice system, education. But what races are most affected by this structural racism? Everyone assumes African Americans, but it's not just them.
Right, right. I think we need to be clear that what motivates what we're talking about isn't necessarily a set of assumptions about Black people or Latinos or LGBTQ plus or women, generally speaking, or the disabled. When we're talking about structural racism, what we're talking about is the way in which disadvantage and advantage are distributed according to the valuation of particular persons. I call it the value gap. And the value gap is this belief that some people ought to be valued more because of the color of their skin. And then that impacts the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. So the short answer to the question is that this is not about these other racialized groups. It's really about white people. It's really about how whiteness distorts and disfigures, right, the very ways in which we live our democracy. Because there's an idea, and it's not just simply an idea, it's a practice, that the color of one's skin should accord one advantage. And the society is organized in a way to reflect that. And it's been that way since we reconciled the ideas of freedom with the institution of slavery from the very beginning.
Now, you talked about different forms of structural racism. Discuss political disempowerment and what that means and how that contributes to that structural racism.
Well, it'll look differently depending upon what era we're talking about. So, political disempowerment in the context of the antebellum South, right? Because you have basically Black folk who are chattel. Most are property. They're owned by people, and so they only have standing in the public sphere by way of that person who owns them. They have no public standing outside of their masters, as it were. And free people, free Black people, have no standing politically whatsoever in most cases, right? You think about it in the context of Jim Crow, right? In the South and in the North, in some ways, the period after slavery and the collapse of radical Reconstruction, you're going to have de jure forms of segregation and de facto forms of segregation that could then, in fact, impact political processes. Black folk don't have access to the franchise, even though you have the 15th Amendment. You have certain kinds of policies aimed at disenfranchising Black folk, whether it's literacy tests, poll tax, and the like, having, in some ways, tangible effects on political representation, right? And you see the same thing in northern communities in interesting sorts of ways. Now, fast forward to our current moment, and we see gerrymandered districts, right? Where you see communities that are locked out in so many ways, and the House of Representatives not really being representative of the American people in any serious way, and how that gerrymandering reflects in interesting sorts of ways efforts to build districts that are super districts. They're not penetrable. and they can't change, and so they're not representative because the representative doesn't really have to worry about reelection in that sense. And oftentimes it involves locking certain groups out, or shall we say, reducing them to one district and one district alone, with one representative or two representatives. And so you see it impacting Black political representation in clear and very determinate ways. But that's just a really rough kind of description of how political disenfranchisement can happen.
What about environmental injustice? You hear a lot about that, but how does that contribute to structural racism?
Well, there's a correlation, I think, between who's on the front lines of climate change, who's experiencing um, the deleterious effects of our climate policies, and it's typically poor communities, and poor communities correlate with Black communities. That's not to say Black people are the majority of Black people are poor, but class is experienced in the United States by way of race, right? So there's a correlation between poverty and Blackness and brownness in interesting sorts of ways, even though there are more poor white people than there are poor Black and brown people in the country. Now, what does that mean? You think about Cancer Alley in Louisiana. You think about all of these spaces where climate change is affecting coastal communities. I'm from one. I was born and raised in a small town called Moss Point, Mississippi, and it's a predominantly Black town. Usually the labor force of the predominantly white town, which is Pascagoula. And we were in the New York Times in the early 2000s as an example of environmental racism, because Pascagoula was dumping its waste into the Black community of Moss Point. And so not only are we experiencing the impact of floods, of rising waters, of warming temperatures, of storms, communities that don't have the infrastructure are more vulnerable to these used to be 100-year storms, but every year storms. But it's also the way in which we're exposed to toxins, polluted water. You think about what happened in Flint, Michigan, and Newark, and places like that. So it's the way in which poverty or class correlates with race that predisposes particular communities to a certain kind of vulnerability and precarity. And that's where we can see it, I think, very clearly.
What about, and you mentioned earlier, our criminal justice system clearly has a lot of work to be done with it, but discuss how it is a form of structural racism.
I'll give you an example. I've been working at Princeton for almost 25 years. And, those of you who know about these Ivy League schools, you know that they work hard and they party hard. And so on starting Thursday until Saturday to Sunday morning, these students are going at it. And I think if the police showed up here, right, the number of drug arrests would be off the charts. Right? But when I served on a grand jury in Trenton, what I remember seeing is that all of these drug cases, all of these folk, I said, are Black people the only people who deal drugs in this? Or you go into a traffic court and you say, golly, I guess if Black and brown people don't know how to drive, because you see a disproportionate number of folk of color in these spaces. And so part of what we have to say is that certain communities are over-policed and over-surveilled and underprotected. And I think the way these communities are policed becomes kind of a self-fulfilling narrative, because of the presence of police, there's an exponential rate in the recognition of crime, and so there's this presumption that there's a correlation between these communities and the high volume of illegal activity. When I think if other communities were policed at the same rate and the same level, we might see the numbers might skew in interesting sorts of ways. So what are we seeing? We're seeing communities that are over-policed and over-surveilled and underprotected. And you read that into the ongoing moral panic around crime. That is to say that Black folk are the source, Black poor folk in particular, are the source of criminal threat. And what you get in response is calls for law and order, calls for the carceral state. And so one of the interesting things, or one of the terrible facts about the U.S., is the rate in the U.S. of incarcerating our population. We are one of the leading industrialized countries in imprisoning folk. And those, in terms of percentage of populations, the prison population disproportionately black and brown, given the percentages of the size of these communities in terms of the overall population of the country. And so I think built in to a certain notion of policing, Doc, is how do we keep these particular folk corralled into their areas, and how do we prevent them from destabilizing our democracy, because they're always already viewed as a destabilizing threat.
Now, you mentioned healthcare, and as a physician, I wanted to get your impact or your input on how structural racism ultimately affects healthcare and access to healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, hospitals, are they the hospitals that are available in urban communities, and whether or not they're properly resourced, and the way in which healthcare delivery um, is impacted by racial bias. We could tell the story around sickle cell and the way sickle cell has been treated historically. We could tell the story about Black women mortality rates and the way in which they're higher in terms of pregnancy delivery. Right? That we can use the story of Serena Williams, who knew something was wrong, but nobody would listen to her. And if she hadn't been so familiar with her body, she would have succumbed in so many ways. And so I think part of we're talking about not only where these places are, where the hospitals are, and the services that are provided to these communities, and how that is differentiated on the basis of race and place, because we're seeing some other similar structural realities in rural areas, right? In rural America, access to healthcare, access to quality physicians, and the like. And this has a long history in so many ways. I can't begin to tell you the number of stories, Doc, of Black folk who've lost family members because they came to hospitals and those hospitals refused to serve Black folk. We could talk about historic hospitals in, say, Atlanta, Grady, right, that served Black folk because no other hospital would take them in. And the moment in which Grady, in recent history, was facing financial difficulty, one of the motivations for many folk to come to the rescue of the hospital is because if Grady folded, where would all of these people go? They would end up in your hospitals, right? And then, of course, they didn't want that. So it's a long history. You know more about it than I do, but it has everything to do with where these hospitals are placed, the kinds of services that are delivered, and the way illness is thought of in relation to the Black body, right? The way we can, in some ways, how can I say, deal with pain and sickness, as it were.
Now, I would say we've already established that clearly it's an important issue in this country. How do we move ahead, take action, and dismantle structural racism? Give me your top 2 or 3 strategies that we should implement.
So I want us to first tell ourselves the truth. America doesn't look the way it looks by accident. The state of Mississippi doesn't look the way it looks by accident. This is the result of deliberate policy. So we cannot act as if we didn't have a dual labor market or a dual housing market, or that there weren't segregated schools, or that there wasn't redlining, or that the society that we see, that the wealth gap is just a result of the fact that Black folk don't save at the same rates. That's just not true. Or that the education gap is a result of our unwillingness to learn. That's just not true, right? When we tell ourselves the history, we know that deliberate policy produced these differential outcomes. So the first thing we have to admit is that we have to be as deliberate in dismantling racial injustice as we were in creating it. I think that's the first thing. And then how do we go about doing that? I think we have to choose at least 3 areas of concern. One for me is, of course, education. America has never really committed itself to educating all of our children. And now we're about to enter into a period politically, Doc, where there's going to be a wholesale attack on the Department of Education. There's going to be a wholesale attack on the DOE. And the wholesale attack on the Department of Education involves, right, addressing, think about what's going to happen to that 18 point something billion dollar investment in Title I, where K through 12 can address students with disabilities and the like. Think about the $1 trillion budget around student loans that allow for working people and the like to be able to go to college, and who's going to administer Pell Grants and the like, right? So we're going to see in policy differential impacts on communities that who just got access to higher ed, who really don't have the quality elementary school, K through 12 schools in their communities, right? And so education becomes a site. What does it mean to fight for quality education? The second area for me, of course, has everything to do with criminal justice reform. We're going to have to, in some ways, address this carceral state, because it's not only impacting the lives of individuals who are locked up and thrown away, but the lives of families and communities. Where, recent New York Times piece, is not so recent, just looked at the disappearance of Black men in communities. Why? Because many of them are just gone. And this notion of carcerality now will extend just beyond locking people up, but putting technology on their legs, and, in some ways that you can engage in an ongoing surveillance of them. So we got to begin to think about the way in which race impacts how we think of policing in the country. Every community deserves to be safe. It's not about law and order. It's about safety and security. And safety and security constitute, in my mind, a broader conversation than just police and locking folk up. So education, criminal justice. And the third, I think, involves housing. I mean, Vice President Harris, in her candidacy for the presidency, talked about the housing crisis. We have a housing shortage in this country. Everyone, I think, there's a baseline agreement that everyone outside of children shouldn't be poor, grow up poor, that everyone should, if you're working hard, working 40 hours a week, you should have be able to put a roof over your head, and afford that kind of stability that will allow you to raise a family and to be a contributing citizen in the United States. And in order to do that across the board, we're going to have to address the bias built into our housing market and our rental market. All that, just three areas of concern. There's some knowledgeable people in these areas, much more knowledgeable than me, but I think education, criminal justice reform, and housing, along with the living wage and a range of other things, should be things we should be arguing for.
Now, I want to go back to education and a very controversial topic that came up last year, and now we're starting to feel the effects. But did we take a major step backwards, in your opinion, by removing affirmative action?
Absolutely. First of all, we have to dispel the myth that affirmative action only benefited Black people. Right? I mean, to be honest with you, white women were the most of all the groups. White women benefited almost more than other groups across the board when we talk about affirmative action policies generally. In terms of education, let's just be clear. My father couldn't go to Princeton. Hell, Paul Robeson couldn't go to Princeton. He had to go to Rutgers down the street. And so what does it mean that many of these elite institutions, because that's what affirmative action is really all about, is right? It's not about the local community college. Affirmative action is really about who will get access to these elite institutions where you can acquire certain kind of social capital that could transform the life circumstances of your family. So because so many people are competing now for seats at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Amherst and Williams and Swarthmore and the like, many people who are spending $60K from kindergarten, from preschool, right, all the way to 12th, find out that their children can't get admitted to Princeton. Why? Because these unqualified Black and brown folk, are taking their seats. And that just seems to me to be just patently false, right? How are we going to redress, go back to my train of thought, how do we redress historic harms? Right? Remember, we talked about structural racism as accumulated advantage. What does it mean that most groups only got access to these places, right, in the late 60s and early 70s for women in particular, right? And so what does it mean now for folk to argue for blind merit-based admissions, right, when they're not saying a word about legacies, admissions? They're not saying a word about sports admissions. They might say something about basketball and football, but they're not going to say anything about lacrosse, anything about soccer, anything about those sports that are typically kind of correlated with a certain group, a class strata. So I think we've made a huge mistake, but I think it's a mistake that's deliberate, because gaining access to these places, Doc, have made it possible for an expansion of, well, let me put it this way. We have gained entree into the top 1% by way of affirmative action. It didn't necessarily impact those in the lower quintile, but it has impacted those of us who were in experienced middle class life to kind of move to have upward mobility. And now we're going to see all of that halted almost immediately.
Now, you bring up those three strategies that you think are the most important, but how critical is new legislation and advocacy in our government amongst our leadership, right? You can say whatever you want and people can act individually, but how important is advocacy and legislation at a much higher level?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. Going back to the claim, policy created the world, policy will create a new one. Right? We have to be as deliberate in our effort to dismantle all of this as we were in creating it. But we also have to understand what's happened in Washington, D.C. We have to understand that there are forces that have now taken control of government that are not really interested in governing. Many of those folk believe that big government is the problem, that government as such, it's not just big government, that government as such is the problem. And so their aim is to deconstruct the administrative state, to gum up the federal government in certain ways. So part of, I think, our work involves understanding the importance of the local space, right? To understand the importance of school boards, to understand the importance of the board of supervisors, of city councils, of mayors, because that's where the innovation is going to happen. To understand the importance of state legislatures, that's where the work is going to happen. As Washington, D.C. continues to be dysfunctional, right? The way in which we're going to fundamentally transform our lives is to work right where we are, in the spaces where we are. And that's going to be kind of local politics that can be networked. What you're doing in your local town, I can use as an example in my local town, and then we can network them together, and together we can have national impact. But over these next 4 years, we need to understand the arena within which we pursue policy. And I think it's on the ground right where we are.
Now, you bring up an excellent point early in the talk, and I want to go back to it. And
Sure.
you and I can talk all we want, but at the core of structural racism are white attitudes. And how do we slowly but surely change those white attitudes over time? Because that's going to be not critical; it's going to be mandatory to dismantling structural racism.
It's so hard to break because I've been talking about the intimacy of our hatreds. Right? We're so hyper segregated as a society. That's all you need to do is think about your last wedding that you attended and who went, and think about who was there. I'm at the top of my career, and I live in when I leave work, my world is predominantly Black, even on the golf course, right? Um, so we're walking mysteries to each other, and it's in our private spaces where hatred festers. We know what's being said by our cousins and our uncles around the dinner table, and so what does it mean to address that in any substantive way? We have to figure out how to be together differently, so that the stereotypes don't stand in for the actual human beings. And that's going to require all of us to risk ourselves a bit more, to step outside of our silos. Now, we can try to do some of this with policy, housing policy, right? But even my neighborhood, which feels like it could have been built by the UN, we still aren't right living socially together. If that makes sense. So how do we do it? I think you know, policy, of course, around housing, around education, and the like, is just a first step. But we have to tell the truth. At least I do. And that truth involves and this is going to sound unnecessarily provocative, but I think it's true. An idea of whiteness has to die. Right? We just got to leave behind the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. And that's a moral claim. It's not just a political claim. So we need a revolution of values, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think it's a grassroots effort. I think everything you said, you can have policy, you can have leadership advocacy, which is critical, but at the end of the day, it's a grassroots effort. It's you talking to your friends, to your neighborhood, to the people you work with, your colleagues. And I think when people see that acceptance and that lack of hate, they tend to respect it and they tend to follow it. And I think it's about education, meaning educating people on why hatred is obviously not the right answer, and how people are essentially equal, and they have to be
Yeah.
treated equal to some extent, obviously, depending on their work ethic and how they get to where they are. But the hatred needs to stop, and I think people need to learn that at a grassroots effort. And I think they also need to realize that dismantling structural racism is not only going to benefit the minorities, it benefits everyone. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how dismantling that structural racism is going to benefit even the white people.
Oh, it's such a wonderful point. I mean, in some ways we have to toss into the trash bin this zero sum game framing, right? That there's only so much only so much resources to go around, because the top 1/10% and 1% have sucked up everything, and leaving the rest of us to kind of scramble over what's left. We have to kind of rid ourselves that there's only so much to go around, only so much pie to go around. We could bake a bigger damn pie, right? And I get this example from Heather McGhee in her book, The Sum of Us. She talks about public pools, right? And she talks about that moment in the mid 20th century and a little bit earlier, where you have immigration from Eastern Europe and the like, and there was this worry by city planners. This is around the 30s and 40s, a worry about city planners that people were becoming siloed, that they were just speaking their own languages in their communities, and they wanted to bring them out so that we can get a notion of American. So they built these massive public pools, right? These massive public pools, and kids would come out, put on their swim trunks, families would come out and go swimming. Now, mind you, Black people were excluded from those pools. And so we were drowning in creeks. If you go back just one generation, a whole bunch of Black folk don't know how to swim. And the moment we started clamoring for access to these public schools, guess what happened? They shut them down. They filled them with concrete. So here you have a public good, a public resource for the whole community. And because of racism, it's not available to the community at all anymore. And
Crazy.
instead, what we get is swimming clubs. So it becomes classed. You can only join this if you could pay that, when in fact your tax dollars were in fact paying for the public swimming pool. So the point is that sometimes in our efforts to exclude, we exclude ourselves. And I use this as an example with the Department of Education. You got all of these folk who want to defund the Department of Education. What does that mean for special ed classes? What does that mean for students with disabilities? What will that mean for working class white folk? What will that mean for working people in rural areas? It's going to impact and affect, right, a whole range of Americans when you think you're just simply excluding certain folk.
Now, listen, final question, because I know you're super busy, but
Sure.
we're we've clearly come a long way over the last several decades, with a lot of work still to be done. But in your opinion, are we currently headed in the right direction as a country?
No, no, we're not. We're in the midst of of a betrayal, of a backlash. And usually when the country makes this sort of turn, we stay in it for about 40 to 50 years.
Hmm.
Hopefully time is compressed, given the nature of our current lives, that we won't be in that cycle for that long. But there's a darkness, to invoke William Yeats. The darkness drops again. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. There is an ugliness afoot. I don't think, you know what, Doc, I don't think we have really come to terms with the grief after COVID. You can't have 1,000,000+ people die. They're gone. And then we just get about our business as if nothing has happened to us. Those empty chairs, those missing people, what you saw, right? You just can't be okay with it. And I'm from the South. I'm a country boy. And, where I'm from, when people don't die right, they don't stay in the ground. They haunt. So I think our debt is haunting us right now. And so not only do we have the ugliness of the rightward turn in the country, I think we're broken, and we haven't quite taken the time to deal with our grief in the way that we should.
Yeah, it's sad to hear that, and I totally agree with you. First of all, phenomenal interview. I've been looking forward to kind of getting your insights on this critical topic for a while, and I think the take-home message for our listeners is we all have to do our job. This is Yes, we need leadership. Yes, it's got to be at the government level for sure. Doesn't mean that we all can't do our job and educate the people around us on why equality is important. And you brought up critical points, and it's something that I live every day. And I think that our listeners need to realize that the onus is on them. It's on all of us. We all need to
Exactly.
take every single day and make a difference, even if it's small. Make a difference in your circle, and eventually that'll have a huge impact.
Amen. Amen. Amen.
Well, listen, Professor, amazing interview. Have a great day. I really appreciate your time. Okay.
All right, Doc, you take care of yourself. Bye bye.
Take care, buddy.